Welcome to the Sound of Ideas from IdeaStream Public Media. I'm Drew Mazius in today for Stephanie Haney. Thanks for joining us. If you spent much time on social media, you may have seen someone post about peptides and how they can be used for weight loss, help you recover from an injury, or even keep that youthful glow to your skin. The problem with these claims? They're being made about synthetic chemicals, many of which are unregulated. An advisory panel recently weighed in and recommended that the FDA approve several new peptides for wider use. But some medical professionals are still warning that these compounds exist in a legal gray area and could be dangerous if not researched and utilized properly. To kick off this hour, we'll learn a bit more about peptides, what they are, and why the FDA is so focused on them right now. And then we close the show with a discussion about a blockbuster that's been 2,500 years in the making and why The Odyssey still seems to resonate with the public. But first, with me to talk a bit about peptides and what's been happening with the FDA is Dr. Celine Gounder, editor-at-large for public health at KFF Health News. Dr. Gounder, welcome to The Sound of Ideas. And Christina Jewett joins us as well. She's a reporter for the New York Times who covered the Food and Drug Administration. Christina, thanks for being with us as well.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And if you'd like to join the conversation, give us a call, 866-578-0903, or send us an email, soi@ideastream.org, or you can send us a message on Instagram. We're at The Sound of Ideas. Now, Christina, I'd like to begin with you and learn a little bit more about peptides and how you've been covering this. This is a large category. We've seen it thrown around everywhere from collagen supplements to insulin. Can you tell us a little bit more about how they function and how they're used in the body?
A peptide is basically a chain of amino acids. It's a little considered a little simpler than your typical drug. There are some peptides that are widely known and well understood. Those include insulin and also the GLP-1 weight loss drugs that have been, thoroughly studied and approved by the FDA for widespread use. And those operate in a really highly regulated manner where you get a very pure product without any sort of weird byproducts, and there's a lot of knowledge and understanding of those. But the peptides we're talking about today are not really well tested or understood. They've been studied in the Petri dish, they've been studied in animals, very small studies in humans. So kind of at the time, under the headline of basically experimental right now.
Mm. And Celine, can you expand on that a little bit and talk a little bit more about how long peptides have been researched in general in the medical community and just how they've kind of increased in popularity over these last couple of years?
Yeah, so just to recap, what is a peptide? It's a short amino acid change. It's too short to fold into the stable 3D structures that give proteins function. They act more like a signal or a hormone. And one of the reasons it's not surprising that we're seeing peptides on the rise is they're cheap to synthesize chemically, in contrast to, say, a protein or an antibody, which would need living cells to produce. So peptide really just describes the chemistry. You have a range of peptides that Christina mentioned, including insulin, oxytocin is another peptide, but so is, for example, mushroom toxins or venom toxins. It's kind of like saying carbs. Carbs cover both kale and cyanide-releasing apricot pits that in the past were sold as cancer cures. So the idea that you trust it just because it's a carbohydrate or because it's a peptide doesn't really make a lot of sense. There's a huge diversity within that category, and also in terms of safety and effectiveness. Why are we seeing this on the rise? I think this is the Ozempic halo effect, because GLP-1 drugs like semaglutide, tirzepatide, these are peptides, except that these peptides actually went through real randomized placebo-controlled clinical trials, phase 3 trials, and that credibility that those approved drugs have now received for good reason, that credibility is being borrowed by untested peptide products that really just share that one category, the peptide category. But again, that doesn't really tell you anything about the safety and efficacy of the medication or the drug.
Thanks for that, Celine. So, getting to this current news, last month in July, an FDA advisory panel recommended broader use and access to some of these peptides, and that doesn't mean the FDA has approved these yet. Christina, can you explain what the function of this advisory panel is, and what peptides they're looking at right now?
Yeah, well, the first thing I just want to go back to your question, not to be annoying, but approval's not actually on the table here. What this committee did is they looked at listing. This is a whole new world that we don't talk about very often, but it's almost something you consider, kind of a loophole in a way. They're considering whether to list these peptides as substances that specialized pharmacies can routinely compound. Basically, this is sort of written into the law for these very rare incidents where maybe a patient with a rare disease who has a certain allergy or intolerance needs a specific bulk substance made individually in a special pharmacy. And so this is what's at the table. And there's absolutely an expectation that sort of the intent of this law is going to be distorted because you have these huge compounding pharmacy companies like Hims and Noom expressing interest. You have Rite Aid already has a peptides, like riteaid.com/peptides. They're looking at this. So this is basically an FDA provision that was created for a very niche use case that's probably going to be used very broadly. And essentially the committee was looking at this question of should we take these 7 peptides and remove them from sort of a list where the Biden administration had put them in category 2, not considered safe. And this is a question of whether we should move them into category 1, considered safe for widespread use. Well, I guess not widespread was never really the intent, but just, on the okay to compound list. So that's really what was on the table with this committee in recent weeks.
Yeah. If you're just joining us on The Sound of Ideas, we're speaking about peptides and some of the recent moves by the FDA or suggestions by an advisory panel there. If you want to join the conversation, 866-578-0903. Again, that phone number is 866-578-0903, or you can send an email, soi@ideastream.org. CJ sends us an email. They say peptides are merely short chains of amino acids. We talked about that already. When we eat protein, it is broken down to amino acids. The same happens with peptides. So what is the concern about peptides being potentially dangerous to humans? Do the quote-unquote new peptides on the market contain amino acids other than the 20 naturally occurring ones? Or are there other additional metabolic products of peptide digestion besides amino acids? Celine, is that something you can speak to? New peptides on the market? Go ahead.
Well, that's sort of like saying we've had atoms, electrons, protons, neutrons forever. Why would some new drug be unsafe? Because isn't it made up of those electrons, protons, and neutrons? It has to do with how it actually functions, what that specific combination of amino acids, what the function of that peptide is. Think about a computer program. We think of ones and zeros. Well, there are computer programs that can do a lot of good. There are computer programs that are now being used to hack into water systems in the Western United States and for cyber warfare. So, it really has to do with the very specific function of that particular peptide. In the case of the 7 that were being evaluated by the FDA and this external advisory committee, the FDA staff had recommended against all 7 on the same grounds that there's insufficient human safety data, and that there are also some immunogenicity. So, for example, allergic reactions and the like, as well as other concerns common to all of these synthetic peptides. There was only one that the committee vote matched the staff recommendation, in other words, to recommend against. But on the other 6, the external advisory committee overrode the staff by pointing to what they called the strength of available preclinical evidence. Well, preclinical evidence means it hasn't even gone into humans for testing. And think about all of the concerns people have had, for example, about the COVID vaccine, which has now been given to billions of people around the world, where we have very robust safety and efficacy data. You're talking about some, with the peptides here, nowhere, it's not even close. It's not even the same universe of data. And yet people are more than willing to inject themselves with that.
You're talking about those hearings. I read some reporting that it said, quote, observers in the room described an audible gasp when the first tally was announced, noting that the PCAC panel had rarely, if ever, voted against the FDA staff written recommendation. I think so that kind of speaks to your point. Christina, can you talk a little bit more about the reaction from some medical professionals in the wake of these advisory panel hearings?
Yeah, I mean, really, a great deal of concern. I mean, the FDA sort of career scientists themselves raised a lot of really, really interesting and salient issues. I'll just give you two during the hearings. One is that when you say a peptide, there's a popular one called BPC 157. Someone from the FDA got up and said, okay, you've submitted all this paperwork to us and some studies about BP 157. And when we get our chemists in a room and we sort of look at these things, you're looking at products, you have a salt, you have an acetate, you have you have different formulations. And he said it was basically like a Formula One race car, a 1970s Pinto, and a new Volvo. Like the things under the umbrella of BPC 157 were that different, like aspirin versus morphine. Like for starters, he's sort of like, hey, committee, tell us what it is. This is a really foundational thing that when you're actually talking about FDA approval, that's done before like phase one. Like we decide what is this molecule, we characterize it. It's very wonky stuff under the hood we never even think about. So like step one being the FDA's like, we have a list of 7 peptides, but we couldn't even tell you what one of them is. There's a whole bunch of stuff under this umbrella. And then the other thing is that even some of the people on the panel, there were a bunch of new members that HHS nominated who sell peptides. There were 8 new members, 6 of whom are in the peptide sales area. Even those folks said, we want safety guardrails. Listing isn't like approval, so you don't have the requirements to go around an approved drug. And they said, we want that safety. We want adverse event reporting. We want purity testing. And what the FDA said was like, look, we don't have that authority. We either put it on the list or we don't put it on the list. The list was never meant for anything for like widespread, use by healthy people. It's a totally foreign concept to the FDA to wrap their minds around something that is this popular that could go through that channel. So those are a couple of the concerns just from sort of Jump Street from the scientists at the FDA with sort of how this might look going forward.
Thanks for that. Dr. Gounder, we were talking about use, and Christina, they're talking about widespread use. Let's get into that, of how people are obtaining these peptides, where they're manufactured, and kind of what the landscape looks like for people to obtain these and then use them. Can you paint us a picture there?
Yeah, so a lot of this is being obtained online. So you have creators, influencers who will post before and after videos. They'll say, peptides changed my life. Very often there is a vendor relationship and they'll give a link to a code, a discount code, which then means they get some sort of commission back when somebody buys the product using that code. One of the things to understand, going back to how easily these are synthesized with current biochemistry, is the labs that are producing these are kind of the same labs in China that are producing things like fentanyl. So fentanyl is an older kind of drug than peptides. It's a little bit more complicated to synthesize a peptide, but our biochemistry has advanced enough that now you can also easily synthesize a peptide in a lab. So we've gone from, okay, we're going to make things like fentanyl in a lab to peptides in a lab. And so you have this gray market, or, in some cases, a legal market of these drugs being synthesized in China and being shipped over to the United States.
Thanks for that. If you're just joining us on The Sound of Ideas, we're spending a couple more minutes talking about peptides. 866-578-0903 is the phone number to call. Again, 866-578-0903 or soi@ideastream.org. That email, once again, soi@ideastream.org. Dave writes in and he says, has RFK Jr. or Dr. Oz commented on this? Do you think peptides are snake oil? Christina, I want to ask you about that, the political aspect of this. RFK Jr., Health and Human Service Secretary, he oversees the FDA, and he has been outspoken about his own personal use of peptides. Can you talk a little bit about what he has said and his position maybe influencing these hearings?
Yeah, I mean, he has said that he wants these available for broader use, essentially. One of the very early tweets he had when his name first came up from the mouth of President Trump in terms of, being part of the administration, he said he's going to end the FDA's sort of quote unquote war on peptides and some other products like raw milk. And he said on podcasts that he, has used peptides to good effect, and that he just wants FDA to do the science, but don't tell people what they can and cannot use, what they can and cannot prescribe. I'll read a quote from him is, if you want to take an experimental drug, you can do that. You ought to be able to do that. So Mr. Kennedy is definitely in favor of having this available for people.
Mm-hmm. And Christina, staying with you, a term that you used earlier that I want to explain for our audience members a little bit was this compounding pharmacies. Can you talk about what those are and kind of how they play into this landscape of peptides and the distribution of those, the creation of those?
Yeah. Those are specialized pharmacies that can make sort of a individualized item for people. I mean, one example is, taking amoxicillin for your toddler and mixing it, with a fluid, and, taking a powder, put it in the fluid, add the bubblegum flavor, make it pink, and everyone's happy, and that your infection's gone and your toddler's back to normal. So, I mean, that's a really simple example of compounding. And compounding pharmacies have become a huge business. These companies like Hims and Hers and Noom, Ro, there's a lot of direct, there's a telehealth component where you can, very easily get, the common one is GLP-1s compounded in a specialized pharmacy, and people can get those for lower cost. The FDA's tried to enforce over that. And a really key difference here is that often, those pharmacies are working with the same GLP-1 product that comes from an FDA-regulated facility, which is just not the case now with these other peptides that are under consideration. So I think Dr. Gounder's halo effect comment was pretty appropriate. It's just really a question of whether that halo actually extends to these peptides, what they do, if they do anything, and whether they're going to be manufactured with any kind of official safe standard, because that's not really a requirement for this listing process.
Dr. Gounder, you reported on a facet of this conversation that I found particularly interesting, that the people who are advocating for these cheap and unregulated peptides argue that traditional pharmaceuticals are too expensive. Quote, conventional medicine is captured by profit. And you say that some of this grievance is earned. Can you talk about that perspective a little bit and where they're coming from?
Well, I think our healthcare system is failing people. It is too expensive. It is not accessible or affordable. Healthcare related bills are the number one cause of bankruptcy in this country. And if you look at polling right now, healthcare affordability is number one, number two, consistently in terms of major top issues on voters' list of concerns. And that extends across the political spectrum. That is not unique to one side or the other. And so this is clearly an area where we are not delivering. I think there's been a lot of focus on, quote, big pharma. Big pharma is one piece of it, but you don't necessarily want to replace that with another industry that is equally, if not more, exploitive and profit driven. The way in which they can sell products for cheaper in this supplement wellness gray market space, so peptides as well as other things, is that they are not conducting those clinical trials, and clinical trials cost millions of dollars. They're very expensive. And so those costs are factored into the cost of the drug. So if you skip that, you can provide peptides or whatever it is for cheaper, but you've also done so at the expense of knowing whether that is something that is safe and effective. And so I think we need to be paying more attention to how do we reform our health system to better deliver for people. And that's not just pharma, it's not just this wellness sector, it's also healthcare systems and more. And how do we make those changes? That's been a very political issue for decades now, going back to, well, really the start of Medicare, Medicaid in the 60s. You have Hillary Clinton in the 90s, then Obama with the Affordable Care Act. So this has been an area of tremendous lobbying, entrenched moneyed interests, fighting for the status quo. But that's really where the change needs to happen, not by bringing back the snake oils of the late 1800s and early 1900s.
Yeah, and Dr. Gounder, sticking with you, I'm curious about where people go for more information about this sort of thing. Because personally, I'm interested in this topic because I'm 40. I'm in my 40s. I run, so I take collagen peptides for my joints. I've heard that's a good thing to take. But this segment makes me question those things and how they're accessible. At a place like Target or a GNC or a Rite Aid. Is that confusing? Is that concerning to people that this label gets thrown on a lot of different places, whether they're legitimate or not, or just such a big gray category?
Yeah. So I think your number one best resource is your own physician, your primary care physician. Unfortunately, many people in this country do not have one, do not have access to one. Going back to some of what I was just discussing. I think some of what Christina has been writing for the New York Times, or what I've been writing on in my newsletter and cover on CBS News, finding people who actually have scientific or clinical training, who are trying to provide that information. It is a very confusing time, though, because if you look at who are the health influencers, some of them are even doctors, but who are speaking about areas of medicine in which they have no training or expertise, and who are also have financial conflicts of interests. So I think, that's a major question to be asking, is what's in it for this person who's telling me this? Are they making money off of it? And it's not just big pharma that's out to make money. There's a lot of other people and a lot of other companies that are looking to make money.
Christina, one final question to you before we wrap this. Just in the coming weeks, you're covering the FDA from the New York Times. What are you going to be watching for? Anything on the schedule? Any sort of more advisory committee meetings you're going to be looking at?
No, not exactly. I mean, with peptides, I'm really just interested in what process we're going to see going forward. Like I said, there was a lot of concerns about safety, even from the people who sell peptides and want to sell more peptides. How are they going to square this circle of, this process meant for a really niche individual product going, extremely widespread at an FDA that still has PTSD from New England compounding, when dozens of people died and 700 and some people got sick from compounded injections, like we're talking about here. So I'll really be interested to see kind of what happens going forward with peptides, if they get added to the list, and if there really are any guardrails around them.
That's Christina Jewett, a reporter covering the FDA for the New York Times, as well as Dr. Celine Gounder, editor-at-large for public health for KFF Health News. Thanks to both of you for a great conversation today.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
And time now for a quick break, but when we come back, we tackle the Odyssey and why it still seems to matter nearly 3,000 years later. This is The Sound of Ideas. I'm Drew Mazius. We'll be right back, and I promise it won't take us 10 years to come back. You're with The Sound of Ideas from IdeaStream Public Media. I'm Drew Mazius, in today for Stephanie Haney. Thanks so much for staying with us. It's a tale that's inspired countless paintings, sculptures, songs, plays, and film adaptations, including the new nearly 3-hour version by acclaimed director Christopher Nolan, which has already pulled in over $900 million at the box office. The Odyssey, the story of the ancient Greek warrior Odysseus' 10-year quest to return home to his wife and child, is nearly 3,000 years old, but it still seems to grab our attention. Why is that? Do we all crave a good adventure story? Is the thought of Matt Damon escaping a Cyclops that interesting? Or does the story speak to something deeper within us all? We'll spend the rest of the hour today discussing the Odyssey, classic literature, and the ancient Greek from ancient Greece and Rome, and why it still seems to resonate with people. Are students still taking lessons from those stories that they're reading in the classroom, or are they classics because generations of scholars simply say they are? Joining me now in studio is Andrew Hostler, a Latin teacher at Shaker Heights Middle School. Andrew, thanks for being here.
Drew, thank you so much for having me here. I'm really grateful to be here.
Thanks for being here. And joining us from New Hampshire is Dr. Paul Iverson, an associate professor in the Department of Classics at Case Western Reserve University. Paul, thanks for calling in.
Thank you, Drew. Great to be here.
And finally, Dr. Sarah Johnston joins us. She's the Distinguished Professor of Religion and teaches in the Department of Classics at The Ohio State University. Sarah, thanks for being with us as well.
It's a pleasure, Drew.
And if you'd like to join the conversation, call us at 866-578-0903. Perhaps you've already seen the Odyssey and you want to weigh in. Again, 866-578-0903, or send us an email, soi@ideastream.org, or you can message us on Instagram or at The Sound of Ideas. Now, Sarah, I want to start with you and have you give us a little bit more of a summary of the Odyssey. I had a couple lines there at the intro. For those that are unfamiliar, without getting too much into the weeds, what's the story about and how is it laid out?
It's about the many challenges that Odysseus faces as he sails home after the Trojan War with his men, trying to reach the island of Ithaca, where he is king. But simultaneously, and this is important to remember, the Odyssey is about how his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus, back on Ithaca, are trying to defend that home and eventually helping Odysseus reclaim it.
And Paul, a follow-up to that, the Iliad is all about the tale of the Trojan War. Can you talk about how those are kind of paired together often and often read together, attributed to the writer as well?
Yeah, well, both of them come from what's called the epic cycle in Greek mythology, and the Trojan saga is the biggest piece of the epic cycle. So the Iliad covers about 40 days towards the end of the siege of Troy, and it centers on Achilles' anger at Agamemnon and the eventual death of his friend Patroclus, and then killing of Hector to avenge that death, and that's where it ends with the burial of Hector. And then the Odyssey picks up in the 10th year of Odysseus' return. So actually, the Iliad and Odyssey are just two short pieces of the entire epic cycle. They're the two that we have the only two that we have the full narrative of, and that's why they're read together.
And Paul, staying with you, the poem is attributed to the blind bard of Homer. And do scholars really think that there was one person, one ancient Greek writer, poet who wrote these, or is there an oral tradition that's attributed to these stories?
Yeah, well, this falls under what scholars call the Homeric question. So I think most scholars today, that it's very controversial within circles. Most scholars today think that so all of these different stories in the Iliad and Odyssey, they're part of the epic cycle, like I said, and there are multiple versions out there, and so especially the Iliad shows signs of having been kind of stitched together from various lays and songs in some ways a very inconsistent manner. And so most scholars today, I think there wasn't a blind poet named Homer who composed all these. I think most scholars think that both were composed orally originally, and then eventually, much later, written down. So all of this falls under the Homeric question, and there are a lot of questions about it. But it's definitely oral poetry. I think that's been proven beyond a reasonable doubt, and likely that there's more than one editor at certain points.
Thanks for that, Paul. While doing some research for this segment, I was reading that the techniques used in the Odyssey are flashbacks and jumping around from scenes and different narrators, perhaps an unreliable narrator here and there. And it almost resembles a Christopher Nolan film, if you've ever seen any of his other movies. Paul, what do you think about the structure of the Odyssey and how that might appeal to modern folks that are used to seeing films kind of produced in that way?
Yeah, well, it definitely is like that. So the real Odyssey, it starts out um, in Olympus, and the gods are there's an assembly of the gods, and they're debating whether or not Odysseus should return home. And the gods, Athena persuades Zeus, yeah, it's time for Odysseus to return home. He's stuck on Calypso's island with her at this point. And then um, and then the next four books center on Telemachus searching for his father and heading to Sparta. And then at book five, there's we jump back to Odysseus on the island with Calypso, and at that moment, there's sort of like a stitch in time, kind of where the gods are still in their meeting on Olympus, and they're saying that he's got to go home. And so Calypso is warned that Odysseus must go home. And then Odysseus then leaves, and eventually he comes to the island of Scheria where the Phaeacians are. And there he sings the tale of his return in the evening to the Phaeacians. And this is where the big flashback happens. And this is books 9 to 12 of the Odyssey. And all of the memorable scenes of the Odyssey, the Ciconi, the Laestrygonians, the Cyclops, Aeolus, all of those are actually Odysseus recounting his tale to the Phaeacians in their court. And so that's kind of the first half of the work up until the point that he's still traveling to get home. And then the second half of the book is when he reaches home, books 13 to 24. And there you have all the suitors and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of jumping around in time in the Odyssey. And yes, it's very much like Nolan likes.
Now let's get to Christopher Nolan's modern adaptation. Again, closing in on $1 billion at the box office. Summer blockbuster material. Andrew, I'm curious about your thoughts on this recent adaptation. What'd you think of it?
I loved it. So I watched it this weekend. It was great. I really liked how there were inconsistencies with the book, but that just showed the way that oral tradition and how stories can change over time. I really thought that the acting in it was great. That the physicality of it was amazing, and yeah.
I'm a big Nolan fan. I haven't seen it yet. I'm waiting for some space to open up in the 70 millimeter showing before I can go see it. But maybe this week I'll get to it. Sarah from the Ohio State University, Sarah Johnston. Thoughts on this modern adaptation? If you've been able to see it yet, or excitement around it, that sort of thing.
Yes, I have been able to see it. And I'm going to speak for the moment as a classicist. In other words, I'm going to leave aside any other virtues that the film surely has. But as a classicist, I feel like Nolan has passed up some wonderful opportunities. Odysseus is an extremely clever hero, and this is really entertaining. And we don't really see any of that. One of the most egregious examples is that in the Odyssey, the way that Odysseus escapes from the Cyclops cave is first, he gets the Cyclops drunk. Secondly, he gives the Cyclops a false name so that later when the Cyclops tries to call for help, his fellow Cyclops don't understand what he's saying. And then finally, and almost most importantly, he realizes that to sneak out of the cave, and the Cyclops is sitting at the entrance and sort of, the Cyclops has been blinded by Odysseus while he was drunk. The Cyclops is stealing the sheep as they go out, hoping to catch the men who are trying to sneak out. So Odysseus foresees this and ties his men underneath the sheep. And he himself, since he can't really tie himself under a sheep, clings to the belly of a sheep. And in this way, they escape from the Cyclops cave. So this is a really good example of how throughout the Odyssey, Odysseus impresses us with his brain power, with his craftiness. And Nolan, I think, has missed a big opportunity to allow us to experience the thrills of Odysseus doing this.
Paul, I want you to comment and kind of expand on that a little bit. Let's spend some time because this is, I think, the most common criticism I've heard of Nolan's adaptation is that he takes away that cunning, logical and smarts of Odysseus and kind of creates him as a character with PTSD after the Trojan War. And you and I spoke about this a little bit before the segment. Your thoughts on the adaptation and how Nolan really leaned into this PTSD angle and not necessarily the cunning adventurer that is Odysseus?
Yeah, so I want to start by saying, as far as modern film adaptations of ancient Greek works go, this was one of the more, if not the most serious attempt ever, I think, so it wasn't campy and terribly campy. It had good special effects and things like that. So I allowed that. And I'm also very grateful that it will undoubtedly lead to more interest in actually reading the classics in the classroom. And, so the filming techniques and the landscapes and the vistas, the scene with the Cyclops, Scylla, Charybdis, all of these were the most powerful thing about the film, really, A+ work. But like Sarah, I thought, I thought some of the casting choices, the dialogue and especially the gratuitous changes or omissions to the original were, kind of C or even D work. Not because I think, he should have respected the classics. It's fine for making an modern adaptation. Modern adaptations of Homer are as old as Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. So that's not my problem with the film. It's just the question becomes whether the changes are artistically good choices. And Sarah hits upon the biggest one, and that's, the main character, Odysseus. In the original epic, his defining features are cunning, intelligence, wit, seductive eloquence, and adaptability in a tough situation. And I don't think Matt Damon can play that character, but of course he didn't have to because Nolan's version was not that Odysseus, but rather sort of one-dimensional, guilt-racked, laconic Odysseus full of self-doubt, brought on by, as you alluded to, Drew, post-traumatic stress disorder. And so this isn't all Nolan's invention. There's a scholar named Jonathan Shea who is a doctor actually, and he was one of the early pioneers to diagnose PTSD in American soldiers. And he's written 2 books that are influential in the classics, in classic circles, about how the portraits of Achilles in the Iliad and Odysseus in the Odyssey are consistent with symptoms of PTSD as displayed in Vietnam vets. So, I'm quite sure Nolan must have read these 2 books. And I've always found Shea's first book on Achilles in the Iliad, called Achilles in Vietnam, Combat Trauma and the Undoing of Character. I find that book very compelling. But I think his second book on Odysseus, called Odysseus in America, Combat Trauma and the Trials of Homecoming, is very much a stretch. And I say that because if one wants to have Odysseus in the Odyssey suffering from PTSD, then one has to read all of his encounters with the Laestrygonians, the Cyclops, his affairs, as kind of metaphors or allegories of spiritual and psychological demons preventing a successful homecoming. And that's something that's clearly not in the original. So, that's the big thing. And the other 2 things would be, Sarah mentioned some omissions. I won't go into all those to let other people talk. And then I guess the third thing is that I felt it didn't really transport us back into what one scholar has called the world of Odysseus as much as it could have.
Yeah.
So those are my 3 big criticisms.
If you're just joining us on The Sound of Ideas, if you want to join us, 866-578-0903 is the number to call. We're talking about the Odyssey for the next 10, 12 minutes or so. SOI@ideastream.org is the email. Sarah, I know you wanted to jump in there. Go ahead.
Yeah, Paul very usefully was talking about the PTSD theory, let's call it that, of Odysseus. It's possible to do that and still retain the cleverness. And I want to give a big shout out to a movie that came out in December of 2024 by Umberto Pasolini called The Return. And that stars Ralph Fiennes as Odysseus and Juliette Binoche as Penelope. That Odysseus very clearly has PTSD, but that Odysseus is also clever and has a depth of personality that Nolan's Odysseus simply doesn't have.
Andrew, you're teaching middle school students, and we're having a conversation among classicists here that are people that are very, very invested in Homer and the Odyssey. But when you're trying to teach this kind of literature and these works that are 3,000 years old to young children, kind of like what appeals to them? How do you get this to apply to their lives and get them interested?
Yeah. So obviously the kids love the adventure element of it, the monsters, the Cyclops, all of that stuff. I know that for me, I first read this book in second grade with Maria Cranio, my second grade teacher. It was a kid's book and it had pictures and everything. And I love just being able to see all like the images of the Cyclops, like bashing two people's head together and everything like that. More than just like a fantasy narrative or an adventure narrative, I think specifically with kids in middle school and in high school, they're looking for a way to make sense of the world around them. As we see in Christopher Nolan's Odyssey and in Homer's Odyssey as well, the world is greatly changing. So it's the end of the Bronze Age civilization. We see standardized practices like Xenia, which is like the hospitality between guest and host being broken, and kids are living. Everybody is living right now, in my opinion, in a uncertain world where we're navigating what old traditions do we hold on to, what new traditions do we create. And then there's also the story of friendship, of camaraderie, of trying to save your friends. But then ultimately that despair and the despair of not being able to.
Sarah, if you want to jump in there, you're teaching college level courses and touching on these works. What lessons from the Odyssey resonate with folks that are maybe 18, 20, 21 years old?
Well, one of the things that I try to make resonate with them is the danger of uncontrolled appetites, which comes up over and over again in the Odyssey. For example, Odysseus's men cannot resist eating cattle that belong to the sun god, and therefore they are all destroyed. Only Odysseus makes it home because he has controlled his appetite. He has not eaten those cattle. And variations of this occur throughout the Odyssey. Another really good example is that the suitors whom Odysseus must defeat are portrayed as just being omnivorously hungry for everything that Odysseus possesses. They eat his pigs, they eat his cows, they drink his wine. And of course, they are destroyed at the end as well. So although there's many messages, I think, that one can derive from the Odyssey, one that I find particularly useful with college students is that, because they are at an age where they are learning to handle those appetites in their own lives.
I never thought about the Odyssey, and my mind goes to binge drinking in college and the Odyssey. I never thought that those connections would have been made. Paul, any lessons that Andrew or Sarah didn't touch on that you think still resonate in the Odyssey?
Well, I'm not sure about lessons. I think, for me, when I teach it, what I like to stress is, I like for the students to try to enter into the world of Odysseus and the Iliad and the Odyssey and the epic cycle. And so, I think for me, the lessons that students learn or can learn from it is they can both see how different that society was and its set of assumptions, and then also they can see how alike we are in many ways. And so, so for things like Greek religion, we like to think Greek religion is all about silly mythology and these stories, but, really it's not. So like one of the problems with the film that I didn't like was the portrait of the gods. So take Athena. In real Greek religion, Athena represents wisdom, cunning, that divine inspiration during warfare, and things like that. That's why she's Odysseus' patron deity. And so Athena is actually that power that we can't see that enters somebody's head, unseen to somebody else. And I would think that Hollywood could come up with a good way of portraying, Athena entering somebody's head as an idea in, an artistic, non-campy way. And so, I didn't like the Athena, it wasn't Zendaya's fault. It was the writing of, her kind of being a consoler sitting next to Odysseus. So things about the power of nature, the sea, the sky, things like that. The students then realize, these aren't just, silly stories, but it's actually a kind of worldview that makes sense.
Sarah, we're talking about some of the female characters in the Odyssey and the actresses that are in the modern adaptation. Madeline Miller published Circe back in 2018. That's a reimagining of the witch Circe and her island. What can you tell us about those female characters? Are they three-dimensional characters in the Odyssey? Are they flat? Is this a patriarchal society? What keeps people kind of interested in those characters?
They are very much three-dimensional characters. Penelope, just to start with her, is just as clever as her husband. And she not only comes up with the trick that we do see in the movie, which is that of saying, oh, well, I will pick a husband when I finish weaving this piece of cloth. And then she unravels what she's done every day, each night in secrecy. So we do see that. But more importantly, there's a trick that Penelope uses to make absolutely sure that this man who returns to her after 20 years really is Odysseus. She realizes that only she and Odysseus and one trusted servant know that Odysseus built their common bed around a live olive tree. The olive tree serves as one of the bedposts. So after Odysseus has conquered the suitors and he's saying, here I am, wife, I'm home, she says, I know you're very tired, so for tonight I'm going to have our bed moved out here in the hallway where you can quietly sleep. And Odysseus says, what? How can you move my bed? It's built around an olive tree. And then Penelope knows that this is really her husband, and she welcomes him back at last. So things like that Penelope does are not in the film at all. And I could make similar points about Circe and Calypso. These are three-dimensional characters in the Odyssey. They are beautiful. They sleep with Odysseus, and in the case of Calypso, very much try to keep him. In other words, Calypso does not want him to go home. But we don't see that in the film.
Andrew, we have a couple minutes left here, and one of the reasons I wanted to get you on this program was the fact that Shaker Heights was in the process of eliminating its Latin program at their school district, but hundreds of students signed a letter urging the school district to save the Latin program. And can you talk about that effort and what that says about learning an ancient language, a dead language, something where you're translating maybe some Caesar, maybe some Homer, and why the kids and students are still interested in that sort of thing?
Yeah, it was a really powerful thing. So 2 years ago, our district tried to get rid of Latin at the middle grades level. A lot of students wrote petitions and even attended a school board meeting, and it was great to see that advocacy. I know for me as a student of classics, whenever I started classics when I was in 7th grade, I loved it. It felt like a place where I was welcome, where I was accepted for being strange and loving, just maybe not the norm of society. It was a gift for me. And so specifically at Shaker, it's great to see that is being passed on to another generation. We do a lot of really cool things. Like we just came back from National Latin Convention. This year it was in Indiana University in Bloomington. So we spent a week there. We wore togas. We did toga banquets. We did athletic competitions. It was a lot of fun. And so just seeing students come to class and love the classics, and being able to basically study a language that's been looked at for over 3,000 years, in Latin's case, 2,500 years. Mm-hmm. It's wonderful. It brings this shared commonality between us, between the generations that came before us, the generations that will come after us as well. And the kids just have fun with it. We do a lot of plays, we do a lot of mythology, we do a lot of derivatives and a lot of medical terms. Classics is one of the disciplines that is truly interdisciplinary, salad. It can be everything. So it can be we look at architecture, we look at medical terminology, we look at music, we look at art, we look at anything that you can think of. We look at from a classical lens. We do a play, basically a lawyer play, where one person borrows money from another person, doesn't pay it back, and so he brings him to court and basically calls him a liar. And that's how we learn like personal pronouns, like how to say like I think you're a liar or you're a liar. And the kids like love it. They love just pointing at their classmates and saying like 2S main docs, which means you are a liar. And so it's great. The kids really respond to it.
Yeah, I'm having flashbacks to my the chariot races I did in high school, and semper ubi sub ubi. Always wear underwear for you Latin students out there. Before we close, a couple minutes left. Paul, what about what Andrew said? Does that resonate with students that come through your classroom? How it's kind of an interdisciplinary study, where you might be looking at literature or art or history in different ways after studying the classics?
Yeah, well, first I want to give a big shout out to Andrew and Shaker Heights. My daughter actually took Latin and Greek at Shaker Heights, but then they were kind of ending the program and that sort of thing. And so I was one of those parents that was writing letters and all that. So I'm so happy that they brought middle school Latin back. So the in Case Western we have about, last I knew, about 35 to 40 majors and minors in classics. Almost all of them have other majors and minors. I think, we have a very cohesive unit of students and professors, and I think we do so much more besides just reading the literature. We also do archaeology and travel and things like that. So it is, as Andrew said, it's very interdisciplinary. So languages, literature, architecture, science, philosophy, all these things, classics has, touches upon, and we partner with so many other departments and programs.
Yeah, and I gotta close you there, Paul, because we're running on time. But I do want to thank Andrew Hostler, Latin teacher at Shaker Heights Middle School, Paul Iverson from the Department of Classics at Case Western Reserve University, a student of Sarah Johnston from the Ohio State University. Thank you, all three of you, for a great conversation today.
Thank you for having us.
To be here. Thanks, Drew.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
If you missed any part of the show, you can hear a rebroadcast tonight at 9 on 89.7 WKSU. You can also find every episode of The Sound of Ideas wherever you get your podcasts and on the IdeaStream Public Media YouTube page. Anna Huntsman is in the host chair tomorrow. Stephanie Haney is back on Wednesday. I'm Drew Mazius. I'll talk to you soon.
Support for WKSU is provided by the Cleveland Orchestra,